Ever get that feeling, when you look around that things are, well, just a bit off? Like there's this general weight maybe, negativity, or just a sense that big problems are looming. How do you even process that?
Yeah, I think that's a really common human thing, isn't it? Trying to make sense of the big picture, especially when you feel surrounded by challenges, that feeling of unease, it can be pretty strong.
Well, in this deep dive, we're going to look at one person's really personal way of grappling with those kinds of feelings.
Okay.
We've got a diary entry. It's dated April 30th, 2025, and the title is Nuyo Sayun Aso, Rajrithan,
Right.
which translates roughly to something like calling on Christ's intercession and atonement to stop God's wrath. Rajri's prayer diary.
Wow, okay. So very personal.
Exactly. It's a really intimate look at how someone tries to deal with this sense of maybe divine judgment and looks for intervention through prayer.
And what makes this kind of source so interesting is that it is personal. It's not some detached academic paper. It's a raw reflection, how an old text still speaks to someone today.
Totally. And Rajri's entry really focuses in on one particular story from the Bible. It's the book of Numbers, chapter 16, verses 36 through 50.
Number 16, that's a heavy one.
Yeah, it recounts a pretty intense event, doesn't it? A plague breaks out right after this big rebellion against Moses and Aaron. It feels like a moment where, divine anger is pretty clear.
Oh, absolutely. For anyone familiar with it, number 16 is, well, it's a powerful story about authority, rebellion, and consequence. Korah's rebellion and everything that follows. It serves as a really stark warning in that tradition about challenging leadership that's seen as divinely appointed.
So our mission here, what we want to do is really unpack Rajri's reflections. How does someone take this ancient story about a plague, Moses, Aaron, and find meaning in it for the challenges they see in their own world in 2025? We'll be exploring these themes of intercession, stepping in for others, and atonement, making things right, and just how Rajri navigates this feeling of, impending judgment.
Sounds fascinating. Where does Rajri start?
Okay, so let's get into Rajri's first thoughts on number 16. They seem to really zero in on verses 46 through 48.
Okay.
What seems to grab Rajri is this urgent instruction Moses gives to Aaron. He tells him, basically, take your censer.
Yeah.
It's like an incense burner, right?
Yeah.
Fill it with fire from the altar, add incense, and go. Quickly. Get into the crowd and make atonement for them.
And the urgency is key there.
Definitely. Because, as Moses says, wrath has gone out from the Lord. The plague has begun.
Yeah.
It's already happening.
Right. And Rajri highlights Aaron's response.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Rajri really emphasizes how Aaron just does it immediately, follows the instructions exactly. He runs into the middle of the congregation, gets the incense going.
And then the crucial part.
And positions himself right there between the living and the dead, standing in the gap, basically.
Wow. And the result?
The plague stops. Just like that.
That image, Aaron standing between life and death. It's incredibly powerful. Rajri clearly sees that as, the absolute critical moment of intercession. Someone physically stepping between the disaster and the people.
Exactly. But Rajri also looks back a bit to the verses just before this, Numbers 16.3640.
Okay, what's happening there?
Well, this part deals with what happens after the initial rebellion, where those 250 leaders offered incense wrongly and were consumed by fire.
Oh.
God gives instructions about their bronze censers.
Ah, the censers of the rebels.
Yeah. And what Rajri finds interesting is why God wants them collected. God tells Eleazar, that's Aaron's son, to grab these censers from the fire.
Even though they were used in rebellion.
Right. Because they had been presented before the Lord, they were now considered holy somehow. So they couldn't just be discarded.
Okay, so what happens to them?
The instruction is specific. Hammer them into thin plates to cover the altar.
Cover the altar? Why?
Rajri points out the stated reason. It was meant to be a memorial, a permanent, visible warning sign to the Israelites.
A warning against what?
Against future rebellion, basically.
Yeah.
And specifically, a warning to prevent anyone who wasn't a descendant of Aaron from trying to burn incense before the Lord, performing priestly duties they weren't authorized for.
So a clear object lesson.
That was the intent. But here's where Rajri sees a bit of irony. They note that this act, this memorial, meant as a stark warning.
Yeah.
Well, it didn't quite work out as planned.
Oh, how so? That's a really sharp observation by Rajri. They point out that instead of being this clear deterrent, it paradoxically seemed to just stir up more complaints, more misunderstandings among the people.
They missed the point.
It seems like it. Instead of reflecting on the warning, they apparently just directed their anger and frustration back onto Moses and Aaron. It does make you think, doesn't it? How often warnings, even really clear ones, just get misinterpreted or ignored.
Yeah, which leads us right into the next section Rodri discusses, number 16.4145, the people's reaction. Rodri recounts how, like, the very next day, the whole community starts complaining again, grumbling against Moses and Aaron.
And what are they complaining about this time?
They're blaming them for the deaths that happened because of the divine judgment on the rebellion.
Wow. So completely missing the cause and effect there.
Totally. Failing to recognize why the judgment happened in the first place.
That really highlights maybe a common human thing. When things go wrong, it's sometimes easier to find someone else to blame than to look at, our own part in it.
Definitely seems to be what Rodri sees happening here. The Israelites, probably scared and grieving, just lash out at the leaders instead of understanding the consequences of the rebellion itself.
And things escalate further, don't they?
They do. Rodri notes how the glory of the Lord then appears, and God basically says, that's it, I'm going to destroy this whole assembly.
Whoa.
Yeah. And it's right at that critical moment that Moses and Aaron just fall on their faces, praying, interceding for the people again.
That immediate reaction, falling on their faces, it shows their role, doesn't it, as intermediaries, pleading for mercy even before Moses gets the specific idea about the censer.
Right, which brings us back to what Rodri sees as the absolute core of this passage, the intercession and atonement in verses 46-48.
With Aaron and the censer.
Exactly. Rodri interprets Aaron's action here as a really powerful foreshadowing, like a symbol pointing towards Jesus Christ's role as the ultimate high priest who intercedes for all of us.
Okay, so drawing a direct theological line there, Aaron's physical act representing something much bigger spiritually.
Yeah. Rodri sees the fire from the altar and the incense as symbols for prayer and atonement.
Makes sense.
And they really stress this beat again. Moses says, quickly, take it. Rodri sees that urgency reflecting the, immediate danger of God's wrath and how fast the plague was spreading. Rodri even calls it a kind of spiritual death later on.
That urgency is striking. It really hammers home how critical the situation was. And Rodri's idea of applying this to a spiritual death now, that sounds like a key part of their personal takeaway.
It really is. And then the climax. Aaron standing between the living and the dead. And the plague stops. For Rodri, this is the picture. It's Christ standing between humanity and judgment, bridging that gap.
That visual is just incredibly potent. Aaron physically positioned there between the dead and the living, and that's when the plague stops. It illustrates that idea of a mediator so clearly, someone who can actually turn aside wrath and bring reconciliation.
And Rodri doesn't just leave it there. They actually bring in a New Testament connection, mentioning the book of Hebrews.
Hebrews often talks about Christ as high priest.
Exactly. Rodri notes that Hebrews presents Jesus as the mediator of a better covenant, a high priest who, unlike earthly priests, lives forever to intercede for us.
So connecting Aaron's one-time act to Christ's ongoing intercession.
Precisely. So the big question then is, how does Rodri take all this ancient story, this interpretation, and apply it to their own life, to the world they see around them in 2025?
Right. That's where it gets really personal. Rodri sees direct parallels. They look at the Israelites not recognizing the real source of their problems, just complaining.
And they see that happening today.
Yeah, they seem to feel that in modern situations, maybe societal issues, personal struggles, even problems within a community, people might face difficulties. But instead of looking for, root causes or seeking reconciliation, they just fall back on complaining or negativity, blaming others.
I see. And Rodri worries about the effect of that.
Very much so. They're concerned that this kind of response, this focus on blame and negativity, can actually lead to what they call a spiritual plague.
A spiritual plague. What do you think they mean by that?
Well, it sounds like a metaphor for a growing sense of maybe disconnection, spiritual decline, a loss of vitality within a community, or maybe even more widely, caused by this negative focus.
That's a powerful image.
It really is. It suggests that, not being aware of the deeper stuff and just staying in that negative space can be genuinely damaging, not just to individuals, but to the health of the whole group.
So what's the solution, according to Rodri?
Well, this leads to Rodri's own call to action in the diary.
Exactly. It's basically a plea for Christ to come among them, to intercede, to atone for their failures, and to stop any perceived divine wrath or judgment.
So it directly mirrors Moses telling Aaron what to do back in Numbers.
Deliberately so, it seems. Rodri clearly believes this story isn't just history. Its principles are timeless, and they feel a spiritual response, one rooted in intercession and atonement, is what's needed for the challenges they see.
And does Rodgery see a personal role for themselves in this?
Oh, definitely. They reflect specifically on being part of a spiritual sharing group.
And they feel a real sense of responsibility to, well, to intercede, to step in prayerfully when they sense things getting unstable, when they feel this spiritual plague might be affecting the group members.
Wow, so it's not just an abstract idea for them. They're applying it directly to their community.
Exactly. Rodgery isn't just thinking about scripture, they're trying to actually live it out, to embody those principles in their own relationships and community.
They mention wanting to be like Moses, right?
Yeah.
Sensitive to God's actions.
Yeah, they express this desire to sort of emulate Moses' sensitivity, his awareness of what might be divine action, and to proactively seek Christ's intercession to restore spiritual stability and healing within their group. It's a very active, engaged kind of faith.
It really sounds like it. It's not passive at all.
Not at all. It's about spiritual awareness and relying on what they believe is divine help, alongside their own efforts to, support the people around them.
Rodgery also includes that stark number, doesn't she? The death toll.
Yes, that rather sobering detail. 14,700 people died in that plague. And that's in addition to those who died in Korah's initial rebellion.
It really puts the severity of the situation into perspective.
It absolutely does. And the diary entry also notes that the plague only stopped when Aaron came back to Moses at the entrance of the tent of meeting,
highlighting the importance of his specific action, his obedience.
And maybe the restoration of order, the role of leadership in getting through a crisis. It really drives home the impact attributed to Aaron's intercession.
So wrapping up Rodgery's perspective then, the big takeaway for them seems to be this need for awareness.
Yeah, awareness of potential judgment, maybe, but also the need to actively resist just complaining or being negative.
And remembering past lessons.
Remembering past lessons, exactly, the censers on the altar, and ultimately for Rodgery, relying on Christ's intercession. It's a deeply personal interpretation, but one with pretty significant implications for how they view their world and their place in it.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it gives us this unique window into how someone connects ancient religious texts to their own life, their own time. Rodgery's diary really pushes us to think about faith, prayer, and this whole idea of intercession when facing hard times.
Absolutely.
Okay, so just to pull the threads together from this deep dive into Rodgery's prayer diary, we've really explored some key ideas here. This personal understanding of divine wrath, the critical role of intercession and atonement as a way to respond, and seeing Christ as the ultimate mediator in that whole framework.
And it's been really insightful seeing how Rodgery connects all of that, these ancient concepts, directly to the challenges they perceived back in 2025, especially right within their own spiritual community.
So it really makes you reflect, doesn't it? Like, how do you, listening right now, tend to react when you're up against difficult situations? Whether it's personal stuff or maybe things you see happening in the wider world. Do you ever think about intercession? About looking beyond just the surface complaints to understand what might be going on underneath? Do you see any parallels, maybe in different ways, between that old story from Numbers and things we experience today?
It really leaves us with a challenging question to think about, doesn't it? In a world that's facing so many complex issues, what does it actually mean to stand between the living and the dead? And how might that concept of intercession maybe thought of more broadly, like advocating for others or working for positive change? How might that play a role for us right now in navigating the times we live in? Something to definitely mull over.